Mark, we ready?
Yes, sir.
Well, I'm gonna do my best Mark Dever imitation. Well, all righty, it's 9 o'clock. It's time for our next panel. As everyone's making their way to their seats, let me thank you for sticking back for what I think is going to be a wonderful conversation, particularly following David's excellent message to us just a moment ago. Just sort of set up this conversation in so many rich ways. Let me do a quick round of introductions, and then we'll get in our panel time. Sitting immediately to my right is Curtis Woods. He is Associate Director of Kentucky Baptist. Is that all Baptists without regard to denomination? Or?
That is Southern Baptist.
Southern Baptist.
Kentucky Baptist Convention.
Kentucky Baptist Convention. Amen. Next to him is Mark Dever, Senior Pastor of Capitol Hill Baptist Church, Washington, D.C. Next to him is Dr. Micah Edmondson. Now, you're in the OPC, so would you be a senior pastor or a senior minister?
I am among the 5-point navel gazers.
All right.
Yes, I am, indeed.
Amen. Pastor of New City Fellowship up in Michigan.
Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right.
All right.
Got 5 people from Grand Rapids.
That's right.
Next to him is Dr. Kevin Smith. He is the Executive Director of the Maryland-Delaware
Baptist Convention.
Yeah. Also, professor at Southern Seminary as well.
The Southern
Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And then next to him is our brother H.B. Charles, Senior Pastor at Shiloh Metropolitan Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Florida. And it is 50 years and 1 week since a shot rang out from a 30-06 rifle in Memphis, Tennessee, tearing through the cheek of Dr. Martin Luther King, shattering his jawbone, working its way eventually through his spine, crushing vertebrae, eventually leading to his death. And there has been a lot of reflection on the 50 years since that time, and we thought it important, appropriate to do some reflection of our own in thinking about Dr. Martin Luther King, his life, his legacy, and what we may, as a church today, glean from his labors. And so let me start with a general question to the panel. Let's build a profile. Who was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? I know we know that name, but my guess is many people have never actually read him or heard more than clips from a sermon or recited or read part of, say, the I Have a Dream speech in school or something. But can we flesh this out? I mean, who was Dr. King?
I'll do some early stuff and let my wonderful brother fill in some other things. He was the son of a Baptist preacher in the National Baptist Convention, a denomination that came together at the end of the 19th century after the Civil War, and Black Baptists and white Baptists were still divided, and so rise up independent Baptist churches eventually coalescing there. His father was a leading pastor in that denomination, so biographically he is a son of the black church, son of the Jesus preaching, Bible preaching. He refers to his father and his father's peers as fundamentalists, those about the fundamentals of the gospel. So that's who he is. He is the son of a black Baptist preacher, a son of the Black Baptist Church, and then he goes to school.
Just one question. Isn't he also the grandson of a Methodist minister on his mom's side? Because I think, didn't his mother grow up as a daughter of a Methodist pastor in Atlanta?
Actually, he is the son of a Black Baptist preacher, the grandson of a Black Baptist preacher, and the great-grandson of a Black Baptist preacher.
What about on his mom's side?
And that's actually on his mom's side. So his father, Martin King Sr., or Daddy King, was a Black Baptist preacher. His maternal grandfather, A.D. Williams, was also a Black Baptist preacher. And his maternal great-grandfather, a man named Willis Williams, was a slave exhorter, and eventually went on to become a Baptist minister as well. Yeah. So,
Amen. So definitely a son of the church.
absolutely.
My brother Kevin was passing the baton to you to talk about his education. He goes off undergraduate at Morehouse.
Yeah, that's right.
Later to Crozier Seminary and so on. So talk about how those experiences shaped Dr. King.
Okay, so MLK grew up in the Ebenezer Baptist Church. Again, a son of the Black Baptist Church and the Black Baptist Church tradition. He goes off to Morehouse College, and really in his early days of Morehouse, he underwent a kind of a crisis of faith, in which he was wondering whether or not the faith that he had been taught within the Black Baptist Church tradition really could adequately address the social sufferings of his people, African Americans, and so he struggled with that. He also was in some ways embarrassed by what he thought of as the emotionalism of the Black Baptist Church tradition. And so he went to Morehouse, and he struggled for the first few years of his days at Morehouse. Was an average to below average student at best. And then he met a guy named George Kelsey. And he took an Intro to the New Testament course under George Kelsey. And it was there that he began to have his first real engagement with what we might call Protestant liberalism. But it was Protestant liberalism that was critically engaged. In other words, it was Protestant liberalism that used the categories of Protestant liberalism in order to try to address the black social situation. And that's when King sort of regained confidence in the ability of pastoral ministry and the gospel to address the black social situation. And he sort of said, well, look, if this is what ministry is, then I want to be a minister, you know. And that's and in many ways that was a kind of a revival of his faith convictions. And shortly thereafter, he was ordained at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and then he went into pastoral ministry. After Morehouse, he goes off to Crozier, where he receives an MDiv, and then finally to Boston University, where he received a PhD in systematic theology.
Now, it should have introduced Dr. Edmondson as a King scholar. He's done his PhD work on King's theodicy, and thinking about redemptive suffering in the thinking and the work of King. So we're going to be leaning on this brother a whole lot up here. So finishes up PhD at Boston.
Boston University.
Then comes back south.
Well, that's right. His final years of doctoral work, he takes a call to pastor Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, and that sort of laid the foundation for his involvement in the Montgomery Bus Boycott and later the Civil Rights Movement.
1955, the Montgomery Bus Boycott speech
exactly
was
right.
chosen. It's really launched at that point as just sort of the figure that many people will know of him in the day as a sort of the figurehead of the Civil Rights Movement, the spokesperson of the Civil Rights Movement. But how did Dr. King think of himself?
Yeah, I think primarily he saw himself as an advocate for social justice. And that was, of course, informed through the lens of what King would oftentimes call transformed nonconformity. So when we read Romans chapter 12, verses 1 through 12, it says that we should be transformed by the continual renewing of our mind. King believed that the gospel forced him into the human situation. It forced him to deal with issues of injustice. If it was economic injustice, sociological injustice, he believed that the gospel compelled him to respond. So primarily we think about him as an advocate of social justice, but one who had not forgotten his grandmother, his grandfather, and his father's religion.
Amen. HB, you're a preacher's preacher. Tell us about Dr. King as a preacher.
Yeah, so I first kind of encountered King reading books from my father's study, which were his sermons. And then the circle that my father participated in was the Progressive National Baptist Convention, which was a split from the traditional National Baptist Convention over some of these matters of the place of social justice and the work of the church and the ministry of the gospel. And really, during that period, there was enough of a division in mindset that it gave birth to a new work. And my father was kind of a part of that circle. And those men were so influential because these were men who were preachers. And I don't think you can underestimate their pulpit work as a key element of the influence they were having in a larger movement of civil rights.
Yeah, in many respects, that's how King saw himself, as fundamentally a preacher, and engaging as a preacher in these kinds of issues with a transformative sort of.
That's exactly right. In fact, I mean, there was a time in which, there were folks that actually tried to get King to run for president, and he responded to that by saying that all he ever endeavored to do was to achieve excellence in the gospel ministry.
Yeah.
That was his response to that. And so King saw himself first and foremost as a pastor, as a pastor theologian, and everything that he did was deeply theological. So I think that's one of the great misconceptions about King. I think folks are likely to think of him as activist, ethicist, sort of social icon. In his core, and the way he thought of himself was as a Black Baptist pastor. Yeah.
So how was King thought of? This is an evangelical conference, sort of populated by 12,000 evangelical pastors and lay leaders and members. How was King thought of in evangelical circles?
Well, I'll start with this. I had the privilege of going to Dallas Seminary, 4 years at Dallas Seminary, did additional studies, PhD studies at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And outside of one of my mentors, the late Dr. Eddie B. Lane, I had never been introduced to any works in all of my studies by African American pastor theologians outside of Lane. It was my very last course in PhD studies whereby someone had us read James Melvin Washington's work on King as well as Claiborne Carson's autobiography on King. During that time, I realized that when I started to think about King, I needed to think about King in context. And what I mean by that is that the man is a person who's in environment. So I could not understand him as a pastor theologian, or as some have said, a philosopher king in some regards, without understanding how suffering caused him to think rightly, not only about Christian engagement, but caused him to think rightly about his mortality. And I think Micah does a great job with that, helping us to see how he tried to understand the justice of God in the midst of huge amounts of suffering. And so among evangelicals, sometimes people quickly dismiss King without ever reading his works, is my point. And I have a problem with that, because I feel that we have a responsibility to read individuals sympathetically as well as critically. Read them sympathetically with the James 1:19 vision we've already heard, and we read them critically because we want to make sure that we don't say something about a historical figure that's inconsistent with who they were.
Mark, any thoughts on this? You're a historian, church historian, broad view of the church, good understanding of evangelicalism. What's your sense of, in the 1950s, 1960s, the reception King had among evangelicals?
Let me begin by saying I'm pretty sure Richard Sibbs didn't know Martin Luther King. So my expertise is in 16th, 17th century church history in England. Having said that,
well, he's at least named after Martin Luther.
Well, that's right. Now, his dad's name, though, was Michael originally.
That's right.
And then why did he change it to Martin Luther?
He traveled to Germany, and he was actually, so Daddy King travels to Germany, and he traveled there in order to be a part of a Baptist convention there. And while he was there, this was sort of during the time of the rise of the Nazi movement. And basically, he discovered sort of the legacy, the theological and social legacy of Martin Luther. And he was so impressed by what he discovered that he decided to change his name to Martin Luther. And he goes back, when he travels back to Atlanta, he changes the name of his 5-year-old son from ML Michael Luther King to Martin Luther King. So not only was Daddy King, but also Martin Luther King Jr., they were both called Michael at one point.
This is around what year he makes that?
This was 19, I don't know exactly.
38, 39?
Yeah,
so Micah,
yeah.
that is wonderful.
Yeah.
Mark is ducking the question.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't know, but I would say from the reading I've done, I assume the answer is largely he was received very poorly. You can tell by the sort of pleading tone he has in that letter from the Birmingham jail that the ministers that I assume it was a bit of a polemical ploy, though it may have also been from his heart in saying he expected otherwise. But the response he got from the white Christians, and I'm sure, looking back with our filters today, some of those would be mainline that wouldn't believe the Bible's true, but a lot of them would be evangelical who have the same theology we do, think the Bible's all true. He was disappointed. Yeah. Now, were there exceptions? I'm sure there were. There are famous photographs with Billy Graham, with Martin Luther King Jr. And I know that there are people who would stand up particularly to identify with him, people who would march. Many of those would be mainline Protestants. So I think largely the response would have been negative.
Yeah.
If by evangelical you mean Bible-believing Christian, he had a mixed reaction even within the National Baptist Convention, which is the reason which led to the founding of the Progressive National Baptist Convention in 1961. In 1961, there weren't significant theological differences among Black Baptists. There was methodological distinction or disagreement about how institutionally to engage with the civil rights movement. Not how individual believers should feel, but whether or not the denomination, whether or not institutionally churches and the denominations should be aligned with various elements of the civil rights movement, particularly Dr. King's, particularly the SCLC. And that led to the split with Dr. King and Gardner Taylor, Ventrell Booth, and others in Cincinnati in 1961. So it's not when I think about his courage, it's not as if he was receiving just opposition from whites regarding his methodology. He was also receiving opposition from blacks regarding his methodology.
Kevin, just a question about that. Was a lot of the opposition, you think, from inside African-American churches not merely theologically motivated? It's not the role of the church or the denomination, but part of it just the very typical, I don't want to make more trouble. What you're doing is going to mess things up even worse. So behind that, there was the white opposition?
Yeah, there were elements of that, but I tell you, unfortunately, another large element is personality. The media and reporters, and when people want to know something about civil rights or know what a Black Christian thinks about this, they go to this young minister, Martin Luther King Jr., and the very regal Joseph Harrison Jackson, J.H. Jackson, who is the president of the National Baptist Convention, the president of the largest Black religious organization in the world, is irritated that they aren't coming to him. So you can't I can't line up the percentages, but yeah, there's methodological difference, there's personality and ego conflict. So on all ends, he was a man that dealt with opposition. So, I was happy last week for some various celebrations, but, a lot of people that celebrate Dr. King today, a lot of them that are older didn't support him when he was alive, and a lot of them that are younger wouldn't support him if they were living back in those days. Yeah. He was a very principled man that didn't just see which way the wind was blowing.
That's right. HB, you were going to get in there?
Yeah, he took what I was going to say. That, that these were just real complex issues. Some were issues of theology, some were issues of methodology. I like the way he said it. Some of it were issues of personality. Those men in that circle with King were just considered the young preachers.
Yes.
The young bucks who are kind of bucking the system, and they were not, in some regards, well received. If there is a split in National Baptist life, they lost.
That's right.
And had to go find something new to start. And all of that is taking place in the midst of this movement that people know from cultural and history, but there were complexities he was working through in all of those kinds of things at the same time.
Yeah, so the white ministers that King was addressing in a letter from a Birmingham jail are those that he said were men of goodwill.
Right.
Okay, and then the very reason why he would take the time to write a letter to answer his critics was because he believed that these particular critics were unlike the other fundamentalist evangelical critics who had been criticizing him uncharitably, who had just who didn't have a difference in methodology, who had a difference in sociology and theology, okay? Who basically believed that civil rights issue, that segregation was right and good, and some of them even defended it from the pulpit, right? Some of them had segregation as a policy for church membership and full access to the Lord's table, okay? And that's that. And by the way, I mean, we have a very old history of that in this country, right? I mean, for nearly 450 years, okay, access to full membership within many churches and to the Lord's table was by faith and by racial caste.
Yeah.
Okay? Faith and racial caste. And that is that is clearly a gospel issue. If you haven't realized it by now, these are gospel issues, okay? And because as an ideology, white supremacy was a form of legalism, okay? It was a form of legalism. It was something that was added to the righteousness of Christ in order to bring people to membership at the table of God's acceptance. Now, the black church was a theological and ecclesial response to that form of legalism. It was a kind of reformation, actually, to say that no, not my race, but the righteousness of Christ alone brings us to the table of God's acceptance. And that makes the black church in some ways unique. It makes King's ministry unique as a product of the black church in order to try to contradict this. But these were gospel issues, and evangelicals, folks who would have sort of thought of themselves as evangelicals at the time, they were at best passive and apathetic, and many times at worst downright antagonistic.
On the idea of that being legalism, just as a pastor, I usually reserve the word legalism for faith plus some other good work. Because that's what the circumcision party and the Galatian letter that Paul writes understood themselves to be undertaking, and it had been commanded by God in the Old Testament. Whereas I understand white supremacy is a heresy and a blasphemy. So to call it legalism in my mind, that's almost confusing to me as a pastor. I know what you mean. It's faith plus an evil kind of legalism, but it's a legalism that not only undermines the gospel by hardwiring in virtue as a necessity with faith, but it's taking vice, heresy, and blasphemy. It's marrying opposites together. So I would want some worse word for that.
Right. Well, I mean, I would say, so if you look at, for instance, in Galatians, right, what you see Paul coming against in Galatians is this, what's happening is the Judaizers are actually forcing the Gentiles to become Jews.
Yeah.
Okay, through these rituals.
Yeah, right? You're saying if you want to become a Christian, you have to be baptized as an infant first. Oh no, I'm sorry, circumcised as an infant. Well, very similar, I'm told. Very similar, I'm told.
Welcome to the conference.
Where's Lig and Duncan at?
He's over
Where's
there.
Lig? All right, brother. All right.
I want to turn the conversation a little bit from baptism. Sort of ask a question on the way to a second question. Here's the second question, and that is, what should we be learning from King today? Right? But I want to sort of have you brothers help me answer an objection that will be out there in the minds of some people at least. Some people listening to this conversation would say, why are we having this conversation about a man who is liberal theologically, doesn't hold our theological commitments, would be really quick to point to personal transgressions, moral transgressions in Dr. King's life, Might even bring up questions about plagiarism in his academic training and say, why would we talk about such a man? Why would we look to such a man? And so on. So I would want for some of you guys to sort of speak back to that. Why talk about Dr. King? And then let's turn to what we should be learning, if anything, from Dr. King.
I think Mark, earlier today, he told us that we should be focused and committed to love. When I think about Dr. King, I see an individual who was committed to neighbor love in the beloved community. If there's anyone who serves as an example of giving everything for the aspect of loving the least of these, it's Dr. King. So I feel like, when we think about his vices, we should push towards also trying to think critically about those virtues. And he had many virtues that can be celebrated. Because if the vices keep us from studying historical figures, as a Southern Baptist, there's a lot of people I can't read,
Plus, historically, in every educational institution I've been in, professors have said, hey, this is a good book. Don't pay attention to him on this. Hey, this is a good book. Don't pay attention to him on that. I mean, we distinguish between the stuff of Augustine or Calvin it's a whole lot of Baptists in here, so they don't pay attention to Calvin on everything. We know how to distinguish between doctrinal things, and my pastor, who was honored at this convention last year, DJ Ward, my pastor, he probably put into me a vigorous understanding of the depravity of man. So sin in humans doesn't confuse anybody except secular humanist optimists. No Bible reader is confused about sin in a person. What? What? So I think those things I appreciate Brother Platt just being courageous in his preaching. Those things are often deflections that they might avoid the real meat of the conversation. There's nobody we love that we agree with everything they do doctrinally and theologically. And there's nobody that we love, and the fathers, some of them, we say we didn't question some of the ways they approach key doctrines like the Trinity and the deity of Christ. And so it's a smokescreen and a diversion to try to avoid a true conversation.
Amen.
Yeah.
This is something, go ahead.
No, go ahead, brother.
This is something we can learn. If he was receiving opposition on this end in his denominational home, if he was receiving opposition from brothers that he said were of goodwill in the letter from the Birmingham jail, then obviously, even as we, and I love, Brother Platt said, listen and learn from one another, and then let's leverage our influence for justice. Obviously, methodologically, how we go about that, we'll still disagree on methods. But disagreeing on methods should not cause us to draw back from love as brothers, and disagreeing on methods certainly should not cause us to question another brother's love for the Lord. I mean, I teach at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, had to be approved by Albert Moeller, and I'm saying something about human dignity or Christian unity, and somebody gonna ask me, well, are you liberal or Marxist? I mean, I just want to smack them. So there can be disagreements about methodology without questioning a brother's theological commitment. I mean, Brother Tabidi is nice. Whenever somebody gets irritated with him, they say, well, I wonder if he's a faithful pastor. What kind of stupidness is that? We've got to understand. So he had opposition, methodological opposition from a lot of places. And we need to understand, even as we lean in and learn from one another and then try to push forward in a way that would glorify God, we will still have disagreements. I mean, the Republican platform is not in the New Testament. The Democratic Party platform is not in the New Testament. We will still have disagreements.
Amen. I learned a long time ago If you want your panels interesting, invite Kevin. Interesting and on point. HB, any thoughts? What can we learn from King? What should we be thinking about appropriating and applying, even if we have to modify it for our own day?
Yeah, what I think is important, and I think about as I'm watching things around today, is that Martin King did self-identify and view his understanding of his work as a pastor. And even though there were other organizations they established, so much of what they did was just inevitably church-based and rooted in biblical and Christian convictions. And not so, I would say, in the generation presently. And I think as pastors, I'm not, I preached on the centrality of Christ crucified. And I don't think we must not negotiate that in any way or compromise that in any way. But as we live out our faith, one of the, in the writings of Paul, his reference to identify Christians is both faith in Jesus Christ and love for all the saints.
Yeah.
And both of those were signs that a genuine Christianity was at work. And I think in those regards, there's much we can learn from not just Martin King, but that generation of Christians.
Amen. Micah, I'm just coming down the line here. Micah, any thoughts in terms of things to hold on to?
Sure. So King really, what you see when you see people putting themselves before harm's way, before Bull Connor's billy clubs and attack dogs and fire hoses in Birmingham, is you're seeing more than just a clever social tactic, right? You're actually seeing a public appropriation of a deep theology of the cross, okay? Because nonviolent direct action was something that King himself got from Jesus, what he learned from Jesus, right? The way in which, and as Peter, as he's addressing the saints in Asia Minor in 1 Peter chapter 2, he looks back at the example of Christ, and he looks at the way in which the Christians were suffering and how they might engage their suffering to the glory of God, right? And he thought about undoubtedly the way he himself, Peter himself, responded to injustice and oppression when it came his way. He retaliated. When violence came to him, he retaliated in kind, okay? But he noticed and thought back on Isaiah's great prophecy in Isaiah 53, that the Messiah would be uniquely distinguished by not retaliating in kind, okay? That when he was threatened, he wouldn't threaten. When he was reviled, he wouldn't revile in return, okay? But you know, he continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly, okay? And when you see young people, you know, as I said, putting themselves in harm's way and refusing to revile in return, refusing to retaliate, they're doing it trusting in him who judges justly. They're doing it following the example of Jesus Christ. And so although he sort of got his methodology from Gandhi, he actually got his doctrine from Jesus on that. So nonviolent direct action, which was at the very center of the civil rights movement, really was a public appropriation of a deep theology of the cross. That's something that we have got to understand about it. Yeah.
Mark, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, regardless of what his motives are, and as he wrote about them, we can simply say that he was an exemplar of a deeply Christian understanding of love. Yeah. And I have to say, as somebody who ministers in a probably 70% white community that's affluent and secular and hostile to Christianity, and probably particularly hostile to Baptists, the fact that there is a guy that they all recognize as smelling positive morally, who understood himself to be a Christian and even a Baptist, actually wins a hearing for Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So it is helpful for me in God's strange providence, particularly given the history of Baptists in this country on this topic, which is not a good history, that God in his strange providence would, from all people, not raise up a Hindu who had been nationalized as an American citizen, or learned from Gandhi, or a Roman Catholic, or even an Episcopalian, but a Baptist minister who would understand in some profound ways Christian love and teach about that publicly and try to be an example of that, and really spend 15 years in the public eye trying to forward that agenda. That actually helps and serves me as a pastor today in trying to commend the gospel, get a hearing for the gospel in very secular, hardened ears.
Amen.
I'd simply say that he leveraged his love and his influence in order to help the oppressed and the disenfranchised. One thing that we can't do is we can't have a conversation about Dr. King and leave this place and not put our feet to work. Because love, as we always say, is an action verb, and I think that's what we see from King. It wasn't just talking about his theology. It wasn't talking about his commitment to social justice or his being an advocate for the social gospel. It wasn't about that for him. It was about utilizing his entire being, his influence, his mind, in order to change those who were oppressed. And so for me, when I look at the life of King, that means that when I leave here, I need to look for opportunities to be in the West End of Louisville, ministering well at schools like Phyllis Wheatley, helping beautiful little kids know that not only that they have worth, but God has given them the ability to think critically about information so that they can transform society for the glory of God and for the good of their friends. And that's what he motivates me to do. I have to be about love, not just talk about it.
Amen. I think one of the things that, please.
Amen.
You talk about King's theology and ethics and methodology being profoundly Christian. I think one of the ways you see that is in his emphasis not just on the sort of relief of the oppressed, but also the reclamation and the affirmation of the oppressor.
Yeah, sure.
So when he talks about valuing people, he talks about valuing not just those who have the boot on their necks, but also the one wearing the boot. And so his sort of redemptive emphasis in that sense is deeply Christian and profound, and something I think in our sort of contentious age we need to recover as well. Maybe we would end with one final question. We'll do a sort of lightning round question. Assume there may be some people here who've never read Dr. King or anything about him. Just maybe one quick recommendation for someone to consider: book, article, anything of that sort, sermon that he's written or spoken, by way of introduction.
Volume 6, Advocate for the Social Gospel, Claiborne Carson. I recommend that.
Volume 6?
Yeah, Volume 6.
But just a couple of things. I don't assume that everybody here, particularly if you're older, has read the letter from the Birmingham jail. And if you want an easy thing to get into and read that should be very attractive to you as a Christian, you can go online and just read this. It won't take you that long. Do it tonight before you go to bed, and I think you'll be impressed morally, and you'll want to read more. Just pulling the camera way back to a largely white audience, I think one of the things that is an obligation that we should bear is to know our own history better. There are corners and shadows of our history that we try to ignore, and in some ways we can ignore, and that we make the very people who suffered from our predecessors teach us that history if we learn it at all. And I think it behooves everybody for us to become people who read and learn the truth about African American history. So, when you use some phrase about returning to some golden age in American history, maybe you'll think twice about it. When you think, hey, if we're going to make America great again, maybe the 1950s weren't so great. I mean, maybe they were great in some ways, but there are other ways which they clearly weren't. I mean, name me a decade that was really super. I mean, it's just we're in a fallen world, like Kevin was saying. There's just, what are we surprised about this? So I would say pick up some volume of intro African American history, like before the Mayflower, and just try to learn more of American history. You don't need to necessarily unlearn what you've learned. Add stuff to it. Find out more. And I'll tell you, when I'm reading a lot of African American history, I'm reading a lot of Christian history. I'm reading a lot about my brothers and sisters in Christ. When I go to Mount Vernon and see that place, I have very mixed feelings. The guy who lived there, I don't think was a believer. I don't think he maintained that he was a believer. His wife, I think, did. But I think a lot of the African Americans who physically built it and maintained it, I think they're probably my brothers and sisters in Christ, a lot of them, and I'm probably going to see them in heaven. So I think we just need to, a lot of our white Christians, we just need to rethink history and realize that as Christians, we should have a profoundly different way of reading history. Anyway.
Okay. All right. Just a couple of recommendations on King. I would say that one of the best sort of compilations of King's works is A Testament of Hope by James Melvin Washington. Testament of Hope, great compilation, very affordable. You know, a great biography of Dr. King is Let the Trumpet Sound by Stephen Oates. I would recommend that to anybody. Quick overview of his theology. You want to get MLK for Armchair Theologians by Rufus Burrow Jr. Great look at his sort of cultural roots. There's a Balm in Gilead by Lewis V. Baldwin Jr. And so those are some sources that I would throw out for people.
Amen. Excellent. Kevin, anything to add?
Anything past 1963. Anything other than I Have a Dream. If you want to get spicy, 66, 67, I think are just commendable things. And one thing that you will find is some of the rhetoric of his opponents. You will see that rhetoric is cyclical through American political discourse. And maybe in a conference called Distinct, we can develop a distinct biblical, exegetical type language as we think about issues. I mean, as biblical as American Bible-believing Christians are, it's amazing to have like a 30-minute political discussion and the scripture never comes up. But the notes from your favorite TV station come up, or your favorite politician. We're almost out of time. Christians cannot kiss the elephant or the donkey. And as long as we do that, we're going to have division in the body, because I don't care how you shape it up. It says to Christians on other political whatevers, this political commitment is more important to me than my fellowship with you. And it's painful and it hurts. And people can tell when the family is not the most important thing to other people who say they're in the family.
Well, one quick recommendation, Spotify has an ML King channel.
Sure
So
does.
if you out in the garage working with your hands, you got some time to listen, or you commute, you can listen to a lot of Dr. King and things relative to Dr. King on the Spotify channel. Please join me in thanking the Lord for these brothers and for their serving us here.
Thanks for that good biography, man. Great good biography.